afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 139, Catching Up and Starting Up. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Takeup. I'm happy to have you here for this inaugural Education Friday of the new year. Lots of stuff to handle today. I'm sorry for the slightly late start. We had some audio problems, had a mic not respond nicely, so I'm back to the old mic for a second. I do apologize for the audio quality issues. Starting a new setup and starting a new year can always kind of out some of the problems that you may have or some of the things you may not think you have to deal with as far as the existing setup, which is why we're going to be dealing with a little bit of old business, a little bit of new business today. I thought we'd have a nice gentle start into the year by handling some questions, doing some Q&A for things that I had already promised to ask or to deal with from people, and some things that people had addressed to me this week as far as online social media where people ask me about digitizing, because trust me, I get questions all day every day from multitude sources. We're going to handle some of those questions and do some of that discussion, and also kind of get into what I'm talking about for Q1 planning, for keeping things in mind, being mindful, starting to measure, getting a handle on what you want to do for the coming year and how to deal with that. I know we talked about this before about setting goals, things like that, but I think it's something that's worth chatting about now. And also, like I say always, though I love you guys at the hashtag replay squad, like that you guys come in and always expect and hope that you will join in and add into the comments and get your questions answered by myself and the community here, that the other reciprocators who are around and answering questions, asking questions, and dealing with the realities of embroidery daily. Um, you folks who are live, I'm going to be talking to you live, handling questions live, and getting in some interaction. Not every episode will start with a ton of interaction. Some will, but on this particular day, I thought it'd be a great time for us to get back together, get in touch with each other, answer some questions, talk about the things that have kind of happened over the past year, get in touch with some of the questions that I had in between the break, and start into the new year with some new concepts and new ideas, or at least understanding some concepts and ideas that are coming up, as well as giving you guys a quick preview of the classes that I have coming up. Everyone always asks where I'm going to be live in the coming year. So this is a good chance as any for me to go ahead and let you know where I'm having live classes, what those live classes are going to be about, and where you can attend if you want to. I will tell you more about those as we get closer to them. Though we are getting very, very close to Impressions Long Beach. That is just a little bit over a week and a half away about. And so we are getting into trade show season again. In any case, I'm glad to have you guys here. Going to say hi to some of the folks who are live, and we're going to answer some of the questions that came up in this live Q&A, as well as go on to other things that have been discussed, like I said, in the interim, in the break, and make some plans, hopefully, for content in the coming year. If you guys have content you want, this is your chance. And in fact, that's one of the things I'll do before I say hi to everybody. I'm just going to make this really clear and put this up. You guys know, uh, the request line is open. If you're old enough to have heard this line on radio back in the day when people were requesting songs online, and honestly, in the era of live chat and live streaming, I feel like this is what we all know now, that you can get in touch, reach out, and comment and interact. I'm just letting you know now that this year I am certainly as committed as ever to getting Q&A in and answering your questions and helping you with the things that are troubling you in embroidery, e-commerce, and the decoration business. So the request line is open. As part of that, if you want to go find me over at ericcampbell.com, or better yet, if you want to send me a direct message, I don't always answer quickly, but I try to answer everybody as best I can. Get over to ericcampbell.com/contact page. And to make that even easier, I'm going to go ahead and throw that up as a QR code for those of you who are sitting there with a phone in your hand. You'll be able to grab that later if you need it. But you go over to ericcampbell.com/contact page. There'll be a little email style form. You can drop me a line and let me know what you want to hear about. You have something specific in digitizing you want to deal with. You have something you want to figure out as far as art interpretation, the market for your embroidery business, your segmentation, how to handle e-commerce, how to handle anything in the decoration business that I might have handled up into including workflow and business software and information. All of these things are things that I've had some experience with, and I'm willing to help you with any of them. So, like I said, request lines are open. If you want something for the coming year, this is a good time to get on the schedule with something that I haven't heard of, that I might have some insight in, or that I might be able to learn more about before we have a chance to talk about it, especially as I go into trade show season. Well, I'll be visiting with all of the vendors and the new, seeing the new technologies and the people that are out there now. It's going to be a lot of turnover this year, a lot of new faces in all these businesses and at the trade shows. So it'll be very interesting to get out there and talk to people and find out what is going on in the business. But yeah, the request lines are open. If you have a topic you want, drop it in the comments or jump over to this page and let me know directly. So, like I said, that's part of the old business, I'd say. So we do have some old business to deal with, but I wanted to make sure you guys know that that is the case. I am open. Let's go ahead and say hi to some of the folks who are in here. First, I'm going to let you know, got some questions for literal direct education on some stuff. I'm going to handle it. So Curtis, you had asked a question about some digitizing stuff. You're going to get that answered today. That's the name of the game today. Talking to you guys doing Q&A. But Cindy says, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Cindy. Bill showed up early. He said, this is like showing up to movie theater early. I already ate half my popcorn. Hey, I know how it is. I was unfortunately behind the scenes watching you guys have a chat while I'm trying to fix my microphones. This is what happens when you go live sometimes. But yeah, that is how it goes. Curtis says hello to everybody. Barb is saying hello to everybody. Everybody's hanging out. Frank, great supporter. Frank out in the UK doing great work as always. Saying good evening on YouTube and on Facebook. Thanks for checking in. Got Fanny in as well. Glad to see Fanny here. And we have Jan saying hi as well. So yeah, everybody jump in, say hi, ask questions, and let's do some Q&A. Let's talk about it. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into that first. Like I said, some of the old business, we had some discussions that I think were worth having. I got tagged in on a couple of questions that, funny enough, were related to other questions I had gotten in my private email recently, where we talked about detail, working on things that have an extreme amount of detail. You guys know I've done a lot of work for emblems, a lot of work for crests and shields and badges, things of that nature. Usually a lot of official stuff for police and military. I've done a fair amount of that in my time. Often pieces that I did were for movie shoots, things like that, but they were still essentially official pieces. But I also did things like redesign a large chunk of the stuff for the county where I live in. So I had the sheriffs from the county where I live in. We did a massive series of patches where everything had to be redesigned, redigitized. And honestly, one of the TV shows I worked on was Night Shift for NBC. And we did every week, fairly constantly, different kinds of EMS, fire, and police that were, if not 100% real to the originals, and in fact couldn't be 100% real to the originals, were very detailed and had all of the function and features of the originals. So I get this question pretty frequently. People want to know how to deal with detail. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is we've dealt with this before. We've actually had a really good episode that was specifically on this, so I'm not going to go through an hour and a half of detail stuff. I'm going to cover a few things that I think are really important to remember when we're talking about embroidery, and actually show you one of the things I got tagged in on, one of the images that I got tagged in on, because I think it is worthwhile to kind of, if nothing else, commiserate a little bit and share with the rest of the community what I'm talking about. We talk about these small seals and details, and then I'll show you a couple of examples. Some of the examples you may have already seen, but it's worth talking about. If there is one thing in machine embroidery that is probably the most difficult for people to deal with, especially as they come in, perhaps from the world of printing, perhaps from the world of digital print, especially, is that very small details have to be rendered in thread, and that has a bottom limit for how much detail you can pack in for multiple reasons. Number one, thread is a physical object. When we are drawing with thread, when we are filling spaces with thread and drawing lines with thread, the thinness, the thickness of those lines is directly related to the thickness of the thread itself. And when we are trying to make thicker or thinner lines, the thinnest line we can make is one single stitch, though a single stitch will often show some pebbling or breakage, single straight stitches as we go across. If we have a light color on dark color, especially, every stitch penetration point will show a little bit of shadow, so it can be hard to get a solid line. That's one of our problems we have. Also, as we are trying to build up thickness in lines, we essentially have to double those stitches. We're using straight or manual stitches or running stitches to get that. We double them or triple them, however we do. And each pass builds up thickness, but it's something that we can't see in our digitizing software. If we run our lines directly on top of each other, exactly point for point, as they are stacked in the digital preview, you will not see the additional thickness that you are naturally going to get when two threads that land on top of each other roll off. Two stitches land very close or right on top of each other. The needle deflects a little bit, the stitches roll off, and we end up with thickness, but it's thickness that doesn't show in a digital preview. So when we're drawing details, when we're drawing with thread, we have to remember above all else that we're drawing with something physical. We are stacking physical objects, little pieces of rope, where you think of them as little pixie sticks, a colored stick that is a set thickness and length. And stacking them together and arranging them is how we are going to produce lines, colors, shading, and everything else we do. Or it's like drawing with a ballpoint pen. But the thing is, even that doesn't really work because you can't partially shade outside of a line. We either have a single stitch or we have doubled thickness as they roll off of each other. There can be some variation to how closely they land on each other or alterations of angle, but you will have a larger thickness. You're not getting a partial thread width as part of this thickness that you're building up. So in dealing with detail, we have to remember, number one, that as we get smaller, we're going to have to remember the thread. You have to develop what I like to call a stitch consciousness, using only the stitches you need and none of the stitches you don't. And you have to remember at all times that you are using a physical object with a set size, a set thickness to represent those lines. Also, that your needle, the closeness of one needle drop to another, one penetration point to another matters. If we try and make a stitch so short that the needle doesn't move far enough to drop into a new hole, we are going to cause things like thread breakage, birds nesting, knots, and so forth. If we drop the needle points too close together, we can cause all sorts of binding and other issues. So when we're dealing with detail, a lot of the problem we have happens to be in not remembering that things are physical, that we're dealing with physical stitches, and not working to scale. So the two things to remember here, thread is a set thickness. Certainly, if we're talking about 40 weight thread versus 60 weight thread, 60 weight thread's about 25% thinner. We can go a little smaller with detail, or we can go to 75 weight thread if you want, if you want to play like that. That's the one way we can do it too. We can get to really, really thin threads. But inside of the one color change, the one span of thread that we're working on, we're not changing thickness, and we are bound to the thickness of the thread. And no matter what, we're bound to the physicality of a thread being punched through a garment and through other stacks of thread. Density is real and physical. And the binding of the needle points together, the binding of the thread as it goes through a densely packed, detailed area is real and physical and has to be dealt with. So, what I like to encourage everybody to do is to develop a light hand. Develop a light hand, pull back on detail, pull back on representation, and remember a couple of things, right? So when we're dealing with detail, we are absolutely we're kind of stuck on this concept of making sure every little detail, every little item gets represented, but we have to understand that embroidery itself, especially as we use it here, it's an art of interpretation. This is interpretation, not replication. A piece of art comes in front of us, we see it, we look at what it looks like, we evaluate it at size, we look at the size of the finished piece, we understand things like the smallest stitch that we can make is going to be in 40 weight thread, zero 0.8 to 1 millimeter. The smallest satin stitch column, we like said 1 millimeter wide, 0.8 to 1. We understand that our gaps are about the same 0.8 millimeter gaps between to get clear area between them. We understand essentially how close we can get stitches together and how much we can pile them together. Like I said, I don't want to go over stuff we've gone over a ton, so I'm going to actually stop real quick and remind you guys there has been a really a better, longer version of this that we've done. The emblem styles and digitizing detail episode 33. We talked about it more, and though I'm going to cover some of that, it is here for you if you need it. But episode 33 here should have everything you need. Go ahead and throw this up on a banner for you as well. This is the one we had, so bit.ly/emblem deets. If you want to copy that down quickly, that is the one that goes into it in extreme detail. It goes into a little further detail than what we had here, but I just wanted to remind you of some of these points. So this is where we get into some other things. This piece also, the first half of it is about styles of emblems, and it won't really be the thing you're looking for. Second half of the show gets into things like banner styles, text styles, dealing with issues that can happen with emblems, and into doing fine detail work. So that is something I think I would recommend you check out if you want further detail on this. But as it is, I just wanted to make sure that we, take a moment to kind of discuss this stuff, right? So we know that in embroidery, we're always dealing with interpretation. Interpretation. And I think that it's worth saying this over and over again. The best job for a digitizer is to take the art that they have in front of them and explain to a customer that there is a particular level of detail that's possible, show them what is possible through our own sample work, and then present the best embroidered result. A digitizer's job, in my opinion, is to present the best result in embroidery, the best result for the art in embroidery. I interpret the art in a way that makes it embroider well, so that the garment feels nice, so that it looks nice and isn't overly cluttered, so that the thread doesn't break. And this often requires us to make changes to the original art and or to omit things from the original art that don't work, or to reduce the level of detail. So what we're really looking to do is evaluate the art as we have it at the intended size of the piece and reduce detail where it's necessary. Sometimes this can mean scaling a piece up a little bit, yes, but often I think that that's a band-aid, because we'll end up with people who are wearing 6-inch crests on their chest that look wildly out of place, that are incredibly huge. And the right call, instead of trying to salvage all of the detail to get this thing huge, we have to think about the use case that the person's actually working with. The people who are buying this are not trying to have this 6-inch thing on their chest. It's not normal for their business. It's often not normal as far as looking at other patches in the same range, other emblems in the same range, or even other logos in that same range, unless they are coming to you specifically for something that is incredibly large because they're trying to make it attention getting, or have it be something that is not in the norm for decoration. Usually, if we're over 4 inches tall on a badge, we are really going out of the realm of what's normal, and it's going to look huge on smaller people, especially. It's a lot of stitches, so we're going to get a high stitch count, a lot of time on our machines, as well as being a lot of stitch count if you're charging by stitch count for the customer, and we end up with something that's not the best result for an embroidered garment. It might be the best way to retrieve or to achieve all of the detail inside of a small badge, might be the best way to not throw out any of the small lines in an engraving style rendering, but it's not the best way to achieve an embroidered piece that feels nice, that looks right, that is doing the correct job for the person who's wearing it. So our job is to realize that embroidery is an art interpretation. We interpret, we don't just replicate, and to create the best embroidered result by evaluating and reducing detail. So with that in mind, first I'm going to check the comments before I jump out, but I think that there's some things that are really interesting to deal with. You just have to think about this fact that we're trying to represent less than every detail. One of the easiest way to say this, honestly, is that if we're dealing with a tree, if you talk about drawing a tree, you're not drawing every leaf on the tree, you're drawing a tree. You want to intimate the fact that leaves are there. We are not drawing every leaf and every vein on every leaf on every branch for the tree. If the tree is this big, what we need to do is hint at branches, hint at leaves, draw maybe the trunk itself can be really called out because the trunk is large enough to show up in stitches, and we intimate the concept of the tree. We do not draw every leaf. To draw a tree, you don't start with a leaf. It's something to remember. And especially, let's say we're drawing a forest of tiny trees, which is often the case. We definitely aren't starting on the leaf there. If you start trying to draw a leaf on a tree in a forest on a badge, we have absolutely gone too far. And one of the things that we often do is we zoom in too far without thinking about scale. If you ever wonder why I tell you guys to turn on your grid when you're digitizing, turn on your grid. I like my grid to have 1 millimeter hash marks, whether that's because you have a 10 millimeter grid that has 1 millimeter sub hash marks, or you set your grid at 1 millimeter. I like that 1 millimeter mark on my grid because I can zoom in and I know that any satin stitch that's about as wide as my grid lines is going to be big enough to stitch. I have a really good idea of the holes that I have to leave in order to have clear, kind of what I always say is clear sky, so you can see through any gaps that I leave. I know how long stitches are. If I'm trying to go with individual stitches or detail stitches, I know how long my individual stitches are, and I can see that on the grid. So calibrate your screen so that your screen, when you zoom 1 to 1, you are literally looking physically at your screen at the logo at scale. You're seeing the logo at the scale that it's going to be in the final embroidery. So calibrate your screen. Your software, no matter the software, is going to have some sort of calibration routine that allows you to take a ruler and measure something in the software so that you can say, yep, on my screen, this is the width of this box. And therefore, when I zoom 1 to 1, this is exactly what this screen size should look like. This is the size of the actual piece. And turn on your grid so that when you zoom in, you have a frame of reference for how small you're working. Turn on your grid, calibrate your screen, know how small you're working, import your art at the finished size. I think those three things are just givens. We need to establish a sense of scale so that we know how small we can work and we know how much detail we can take out. So that's part of the evaluation. Like I said, we've talked about this before, so I'm not going to beat it up too much, but I think it's worthwhile to at least go into it. I would like to, in this coming year here, I'm going to try and make the take up a little more tolerable as far as times, and so I'm going to try and keep this to closer to the hour. I've been going the hour and a half regularly, and from what I've heard from some folks, I'm actually covering multiple topics quite a bit, and often I'm covering things that would have been better covered as their entire show instead of rushed through in the last 15 20 minutes. We will try and do more of that and make this where it's a little more tolerable for your schedule as well as mine, but we will continue with other content as well as the take up, so don't think that things are going away, but we're going to try and keep these things closer to an hour, probably try and sequester some of the topics so that they get their own time on the stage. And as we go forward, there may be some other options for me to do some other content that's outside of the take up that's easier to digest for folks. But for right now, just letting you know, that's some of the plans that are going on. But let's finish talking about this, the evaluation and reduction and understanding the interpretation. I would like to go ahead and just go through a couple of images that I have on hand and just kind of give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about. Like I said, if you want this for an hour and a half or for the other second half of the previous show, go check out that one where I talk about badges. Much more specific to patches, but it is still something that I think it comes up in a lot of ways in all manner of municipal and official and police and military is where I've done the most of it. So, state and city and county and all of that stuff. We have a lot of municipal kind of heraldry that happens where you end up with these tiny details, but I talk about it quite a lot there. Let's go ahead and share my second screen here. We'll talk about some different images that I've got here, just some examples to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, right? And actually, first, the one thing I wanted to show you was one of the Facebook versions of this that somebody sent to me and tagged me in on. I don't want to reveal the person's entire work because I didn't get to ask them ahead of time. They were talking about rendering this inside of a piece about the size of a quarter. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about this, part of this is not detail problems. Part of this is art evaluation. If you have art that is this incredibly poor, the likelihood is you're either going to have to find different art somewhere. If it's something that's official or municipal, here's hoping you will find some other version of this. Sometimes if this is a seal that's inside of another badge, which is something I'm going to talk about with my own pieces, I've got pieces where we're talking about a seal that's inside of a badge like we have here. This is the Great Seal of New Mexico. Now, it's incredibly less detailed than the real thing, and I'll bring up this piece of art. You can kind of see in here, even though this was also pretty poor art that was sent to us on this particular piece, that there's a bunch of detail here. And sometimes you'll find that this seal or this piece inside of a badge is actually this Great Seal of New Mexico can be found on its own being used for other uses. And so if you're just confused about what's in here, it's so poor that you can't even make a decision for what's inside of a seal like that. You may be able to find out what that seal is, even if it's living inside of another badge or something else. It may end up being its own thing where you can find art for it by itself. Because yes, though I do have right here the Chief of Police badge for Cuba, New Mexico, what you may find is, yeah, you've got a state seal in here, and inside this, the Great Seal of New Mexico can be had with a great deal more detail than what I have here. Because this is as much detail as I had to work from for this particular piece. You can see kind of what I did, and we'll talk very briefly about what I've done. I've shown you this before, but it's something just to make sure you kind of know. Sometimes there's art problems where it's really about the art being incredibly poor. And in this case, what we have from this particular person who is on one of the stitch artist groups, I believe, she was dealing with a piece of art that, number one, is extremely poor. Number two, when we're rendering this piece at that extreme detail, the thing you're going to have to realize is, though, yes, we can see we've got what it looks to me like we have a bison. Here's hoping. It looks like a bison jumping over a log with some grass. We've got, it looks like someone perhaps chasing them with a hatchet. We've got some trees. We have maybe a sunburst here and a landscape behind them. The thing is, when this is down at the size of a quarter, we know that you're not going to be getting little intimate details on this piece. We're going to have to make some things thicker that might be thin here. We are going to have to reduce levels of detail. And you're going to find that at a distance, which this is the thing I've always been championing throughout my career, the handshake distance. I've always said, American handshake. It was a study that was done like in the late '60s. It said Americans shake hands from about 3 to 4 feet. It's not the same everywhere, but you're usually going to judge somebody's logo, or at least the person is going to be looking at someone else's garment from about 3 feet away. At 3 feet, we don't have to worry so much if, let's say that our hatchet wielding friend here happens to have a certain kind of sideburns. That may not be the biggest deal by the time we're out at 3 feet. But what we do need to say is, all right, if I'm evaluating this piece, I'm going to evaluate it for reduction of detail. What I will say is this: I'm pretty sure that I need to make sure there is a tree here that looks like this tree close enough. Some sort of figure here that has something in their hands that roughly looks like the hatchet, because this is probably a historical figure that's important. I don't know this seal, so I can't tell you. Uh, a bison of some sort here that is able to be seen. The sun is probably important, and I'm sure something about this landscape where this jumping is important as well. But in identifying those pieces, you might realize that you can reduce some of the space in between these pieces, make some things bigger that are more important, and you can most certainly not worry about rendering every line on the bison. Like I said, the hairstyle of our friend here, or every branch or every leaf on this tree. Now, looking at this particular art, you couldn't see a leaf to render it if you wanted to. However, if we do have the art, you still have reason to think sometimes I need to reduce the level of detail that's in there. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and jump into some other examples to show you, and then we'll go ahead and grab some comments from chat before I move on to the next piece. But one of the ones that I often show is this Sandoval County piece, and I'll show it to you in a more detailed way. This is a detail shot of this Sandoval County seal. Sandoval County seal, and it has a Native American fellow here with a conquistador, Spanish, settler here, and we have some folks here with a wagon, and we have some oxen and somebody who's driving them. And we have the Zia symbol sun here, and we've got a river and kind of a plain here. So we've got all these details, and we also have this little small detail. If you look up here under the A in Santa Fe County here, or in Sandoval County, you'll see that we have this little detail under the A. We have lots of little detailed pieces. The thing is, when this is inside of a 2-inch seal, a very small piece. And I don't have a great picture of the finished piece, so I'll just show you the picture I do have of it. This is the final piece. So we're talking about like a 2-inch, very small left chest logo. I think the rendering is fairly successful here. I'm not that unhappy with it. I think I could have opened this up a little bit more. I think on a second rendering, if I was going to do it again today, I think I probably would have expanded the outlines out a little further and given myself a little bit of extra room. I don't think I probably would have necessarily done it exactly the same. I see a little bit of congestion here, but overall, I think it's successful. We can see the person who's there. We can see even the shape of the hat. We can see the hairstyle. We have an inkling of the clothing that's available. We have an idea of the necklace that's here. We have an idea of this driver who even still has the kind of whip that's back here. We have a concept of each of these pieces that's still available. It's still visible and it renders pretty well, and the text is legible from a distance. Everything pretty much checks out. However, pretty easy to see. If we look at this example of me trying to kind of figure out the reductions, and by the way, in this piece, you can also see that I've elected to reduce the color count. I went through and took samples and said, here are all the colors that are present in this logo, but what do I think is absolutely necessary? Things like this. We have these two grays that are here for the armor. We have a lighter gray in the chest. We have a darker gray that's down here for the boots. And it was my call. I thought, you know what? I really don't need a slightly darker charcoal gray in here for this. We're going to reduce that to one color so that I don't have to run multiple colors here. Might not matter to you. In the time that I was doing this work, I had to reduce the colors just to get it on the machine in one run without having to rethread. Now, depends on the machine you have these days. Now we have a lot more needles, and you may elect to remain, with all the colors. What you will notice, however, is some of the editing that I did to these pieces. We've got really thin lines in some of these letters. They're much thicker here. We have, if we look at our friend here, the conquistador, he's got a mouth with a separate mustache and lip. I rendered his face as a couple lines just to indicate that he had the mustache, and you can kind of see that strong line of his nose that's present here. If we're looking at the feather on the Native American fellow, we just rendered that as a stitch out and a stitch back. We didn't even try and render that into colors as we have here because it is just too small to see. And we can kind of see that throughout. There's shading here in the pants on the Native American fellow. He does not have that shading here. I wasn't going to add an extra ivory just to get that shading in here. The satin stitch is going to give me a little bit of shine and shadow, and that's going to be enough to make it work. Certainly, you can see that if we're looking at the oxen that are back here, and we have also passengers in the wagon, there are 2 passengers in the wagon. Am I going to get the passengers in the wagon? No. What I will do is hit a small division line. So if you're looking at it as you're kind of just glancing over it, you can tell something is in the wagon, that it is partially filled with something. Who knows? There's something in there, good enough. We have separation between the oxen, but I'm not doing different colors for their horns. The truth of the matter is that at 3 feet, you just aren't going to see all the details. Do I have the pot that he's holding? Absolutely, I do. Am I worried about the individual parts of the detail here? No, I have a small triangle with 3 stitches that is going to let me know that there is some sort of design or division on the piece. The thing that I had to do with this piece, as with all these pieces, is to talk to the customer and say, what parts of this are the most important? What parts of this are the most critical to see? Now, of course, you can also see this is a different text run on this particular one by Public Works. I do have another one that was State of New Mexico, but we can see that the most important things here are to get some of the stylistic flair in the lettering. We do have these little bits that are under the A's, though you will see that I've thickened them a great deal and that I've dropped the crossbars on the A's to make sure that they run correctly. Um, but the style of the lettering is still intact. The style here, these style elements are intact. We do have at least some version of each of the elements. We have mountains, we have greenery, we have this bank, we have the river, we've got everything that we need to kind of let us know that this wagon is here with the beasts of burden pulling it along. And we have the 2 central figures that are taking up the most of that room, and they have the most detail rendered in them because they are the most important thing in the frame. So that's just something to remember, that you're intimating detail, not trying to get every single piece of it. And like I said, I certainly see in the original piece that I did that there's some stuff that I could have improved that I would probably do different today. But at the size we had it on a textured, fairly thick piqué polo, I was okay with how that turned out. That is not the worst result that you could have. I'll tell you honestly, if I would do it today again, the other thing I'd think about is whether or not I could do this with a patch because we get a lot of finer detail on that. Or if they really were dead set on this, it's okay to recommend printing. That's the thing people will say also, hey, sublimation printing with embroidery on the outside, that's fine. I'm a big fan of embroidery and I love a classic embroidered crest. So I will absolutely try and render detail into a small embroidery. At the same time, it is totally fine to use a different method of decoration if that's what suits the customer best. If the customer says, no, the thing that I want the most is every little bit of this detail and color, and if you have the ability to get them a sublimated transfer that you're going to do, say, an outside embroidered edge, or maybe you just do the outer text and leave the central piece as a sublimated transfer, that is a valid option and one that I've taken myself when it made sense. When people come to me for classic embroidery decoration, though, not always the case. Often I'm going to go ahead and go for it. One of the other pieces that I think will also kind of refers to this well and gives you a concept of dealing with this detail, this Dion's piece is one of my very oldest pieces. I've done it more than a couple times at different sizes, but this is one of the big ones that you'll often see me carry as a sample. And people kind of usually wonder at this one, mostly because when I first did this piece, I actually had software that didn't have a lot of features to it. And almost all of the line work in this piece is done manually. And I mean, stitch by stitch, quite a bit of it is done manually, stitch by stitch. Other pieces of it have some, I don't want to call it automation, but I mean to the level of automation that I filled an area and it wasn't me drawing every single stitch. But this is one of my earliest pieces where I had to punch a lot of it manually. And here is also a color version that was done and that I took care of for the folks over at Dion's. Now, like I said, it's been revised over the years, but you see there's a lot of very small detailed work. And I'll actually call out some of the things about my own work that don't work on this piece. I think actually I was once again a little too dense, but I want to go ahead and show you some things about the face, right? Things that are important in a face. We absolutely have to make sure that eyes are clear and open. Just like when you're looking at people, if something is weird about an eye on like a digital rendering of a person, it always looks a little uncanny and strange. We want clear, open eyes, or clear eyes. Doesn't mean open. I mean open in the fact that we don't want to jam a bunch of thread in there. It doesn't matter what style of eye, or if you have, whatever it is about rendering the person. We just mean open in the fact that we don't want a bunch of detail that's jammed together where it looks like we have just smashed too much thread into the area. What frequently happens, no matter what style of eye we're looking at, people will overdo the detail because eyes are so important. It's like psychologically, evolutionarily, we're so used to looking someone in the eyes and seeing that as an indicator of personhood that we try and put too much detail in the eyes. And being someone who has very small eyes myself, I'll admit, if you try and render me out, you're going to have to be very careful not to close everything up and make it look mashed together. But that's the thing, most of the time what we're doing isn't that we're rendering the style of eye wrong, it's that people are putting too much detail into a small space. And so what you're going to see about these eyes is they are very simple. We have an outline, we have some darkness in the corner that's there, but the pupil that's in here is just a couple stitches that drop down and drop back out in this single color. Certainly if we have a colored eye, we may have to work on how we can interpret that color in. Often the color will drop out on very small eyes because we can't get them to render. Uh, Eyes sometimes are best left at that really low level of detail. The other thing I want to kind of bring up with this, aside from just looking at this detail, is just to remind you once again that this is an art of interpretation and that we're trying to evaluate and reduce detail. To kind of illustrate that, I'm going to show you one of the original pieces. Now, this is actually a revised version of the original art. The original art had a little more detail than this. And so this is not exactly the same as the art that I worked from. This is a revised version that was done for a later anniversary, but this is some of the original art. And I just want you to see it for kind of what it is. We've got some detail and some texture inside of each of the pepperonis. We have lots of little lines and dots, small unconnected dots in the body of the apron here. And in this case, it has colors that didn't end up in the final piece. So we ended up not using quite as dark a yellowish color here. We had kind of an ivory for the apron in our original piece. But you can see how much detail is packed into this very engraving style piece. So this is the kind of art we're looking at. But the thing that I want to bring up, and I'm going to try and show you guys at the same time, if I can, the art itself while we look at one of the embroidered pieces. So here is the art itself. And what I want to call up from this, and if I get them both on screen at the same time, I will. We'll go ahead and show you the art. You can see this art here. And I'm going to go in here and zoom in. We'll have to bring it back up. I just want you to see how much less detail is in some of this. Admittedly, this piece over on the right-hand side was regularized and redrawn to some degree. There's more kind of regular lines here than was in the original piece I worked from, because this is a much older piece of art, but very similar. And what you can see is a lot less detail in some areas. It's lightened up because we were really cognizant of how light or how dark the shading was on different sides. The thing is, if you zoom out and look at this piece and you look at this piece, and especially if I go over here and give you the color versions, back up and pop that color version up so you can look at it, or maybe even the color version by itself, you're not immediately going to look at this piece and say something's wrong, that I missed something, that there's something wrong with this jacket bag, that there's details that are missing, that it looks bad, that there's something bad about the rendering. If you kind of squint at this piece, you're like, all right, the light source is coming from the left-hand side. It's lighter here. There's less detail here, but it's darker over here in the side of the shadow, and it makes sense. But what you will notice is that I did not render every dot, every line, every detail. Not only is it unnecessary, it's counter to what we're trying to get done here. We can end up getting too dark, too dense, and in fact, you may have to do things like switch out to different line styles. And in this case, looking over at the right-hand side of this piece, I didn't want to go as dark and as dense as this. I didn't want to have to try and show just this very slim amount of color through the right-hand side. And in a two-color piece, or in a one-color piece where I really have the background and the color on top of it, I wanted to leave them a little more looseness. What that meant was if I'm lightening up this side so that I can remain drawing my shading in instead of trying to have smaller elements of lighter thread on top, which doesn't usually look all that fantastic, you might decide to lighten up some of the other renderings on the other side. The places where I'm going to call myself out for having kind of, I think, gone too far is I have a little bit too much detail in the face, so it looks a little too dark compared to the original. And I think there's a couple of places up in the chest, up in the face, where I could have removed even further lines. Now, not every lines in the art is even there, but like I said, an early piece of mine, if I were to go back and do this today, I would remove even a few more lines on the side of the nose and the side of the cheek. So what does this mean for what we're doing when we're digitizing? When we're working at an extreme zoom level on a piece, especially, imagine that I've done this piece for left chest and hats as well. I've done very small versions of this. you're definitely not trying to render every line. Whether it's skipping to every other line to make clear spaces, or deciding that some of the shading shouldn't be there at all. What we're trying to do is, when we're looking at this design, let's say we squint at it, we look at it from 3 feet, are the relative values of light and dark where they should be? Yes, we want some of this line work to be maintained. Why? It's an engraving style piece. It should have visible lines. No problem there. But we're trying to maintain some of that line work, but we're not trying to necessarily draw every line. I would say, despite the fact that I can see some flaws in my own pieces, that these are effective renderings of that art. Like I said, I would certainly shorten this up. I am at an angle to this piece, but I can tell there's a little bit too much detail, a little bit too many lines in the cheek, so it's a little too dark. But these are successful renderings of the art that I was presented, despite the fact that they aren't 100% accurate to the art that I was handed. Same kind of thing here, folks. When we look at this piece for Cuba, and sorry, I'm scrolling back and forth trying to get everything back into frame here. We look at this piece for the Cuba police. Am I getting everything out of these eagles? No. At a left chest size, at a hat size, which this had to be, we are not trying to get every feather in the eagle or the eye on this smaller eagle. These are two eagles here. There's a small Mexican brown eagle here, and then we have the bald eagle behind it. We are not going to get every feather. We are not going to get every line, and it's really not desirable. It's not as important as making sure that the things that are supposed to be visible are visible and it represents the overall art correctly. Is it always the best work, or is my work the best work all the time? No, what I will say is, when I see people having trouble with this kind of small work, when they're breaking thread, when they're breaking needles, where their work is puckering or it's doming or dishing in and it's distorted, it's often because they are jamming too much detail in a small space and that they're not really able to render out what they should. So, like I said, one of those things you have to look for, evaluate and reduce. And remember, this is an art of interpretation. So I'm going to grab some comments before I move on to the next couple of things real quick. So in the case you have other stuff to ask, we may have some other things we may not get to today. I am going to try and keep it shorter, like I said. But let's go ahead and grab some comments anyway. Jan says, want to embroider a bear? Lots of details. Need to post a picture on Facebook and ask for advice. Absolutely. I mean, go ahead and ask other folks. The other thing is, if there's one other thing that people do wrong, in my opinion, when they're looking at embroidery, I'm not saying we should copy every work that's out there. People don't look at enough embroidery. I can't tell you, I mean, to my own detriment, because I shouldn't spend all this time doing it, how much time I have spent just looking at embroideries, especially when I first started and there wasn't a lot of education out there. We expect there to be a tutorial of how to get to a result, whereas what I teach is trying to give you the elemental understanding of thread, of density, of stitch types, so that when you go look at other embroideries that you want to emulate, you know how they got there because you can analyze the piece you're looking at, and then you apply the suppositions. Like you say, I'm going to put up a hypothesis. I think this person managed to get this detail by using this kind of straight stitch and spacing it about this far apart. And I think that they match the angle of their fill to this angle so that things would sink in a little bit. And then you make something, you digitize something that has those rules in place, and you see if you get there. That's what I'm trying to teach you guys. But I think a lot of people don't look at embroidery enough. They'll sit there and ask, hey guys, I'm having trouble with this logo. And especially I look at it and go, that's a national logo that probably has 100 embroidered results right now that are decent. Open up your browser, go to Google, say embroidered patch X logo, whatever that is. Start filing through those pictures and looking at how other people rendered them. And if the rendering looks good, look at the stitch angles, look at the stitch types, and do some measuring. I mean, you're not going to get every little thing about the settings in your software from doing that, but by observing different versions, and now don't get me wrong, even if you don't have a logo that is exactly out there, you don't have the art that someone else has already done the work, by all means, just consuming embroidery, looking at pictures, detailed pictures of embroidery, and seeing how things are done will absolutely inform how you do things yourself. So just something to remember, consume embroidery. I mean, look at the different kinds of embroidery out there and just stare at it, look at it, and think about how someone did it. Just allowing yourself some time to do that is going to make a big difference. So a couple more things. Hi, Susan. Happy to see you. Hopefully you're doing out there in rainy Northern California. I saw that it was getting really rough, so hopefully flooding hasn't come your way. Lisa Shaw, educator in her own right and who has an awesome show after hours, so you should check her out. Says interpretation, not replication. Very popular mantra after the holidays with so many new digitizing software owners. Absolutely. Absolutely. Interpretation, not replication. You don't draw every line. No matter what art you do, you don't draw every line unless you are, I mean, okay, don't get me wrong. We are doing little tiny detailed engravings. Fine, maybe that. But in embroidery, we definitely don't want to replicate every little line. So have a couple things. So we got Lena saying Happy New Year, Lena. Janice is helpful. That's great. Thank you, Lena. Love the conversation in depth. I love it. Cindy says, I like reducing colors to get lanes changing colors. Me too. And remember, I started on 6 needle machines, went up to 9 needle machines. They're all commercials. And only later in my career did I do 15s and above. So that's one of those things for sure, right? Uh, couple of things. Couple of things. So we have a few more questions and things here too. No flooding for Susan. Good. Uh, Lisa, guilty of studying embroidery all day long. That's what makes you so good. Aside from just the fact that you got it, you got the juice. You know what you're doing. Cindy says, I just remembered you possibly giving a basic piece of art which practice digitizing. All right, send me a message via my contact form. I'm going to task you with that. If you can remind me via my contact form so I can throw that on my calendar, I will look into sending you guys something to digitize and we'll talk about the results. Don't know when that's going to happen. Very likely after the trade shows, but we'll get there. A couple of other questions, and then I think what I'll do. You know what? We talked about planning for the new year on the previous episode. So what I'm going to tell you guys is let's stick with the Q&A today. We'll stick with the Q&A, keep the shorter show, but the starting into the next quarter, I'm going to give you an article that I put out in Images Magazine to look at, and I think we're going to leave most of that either for the next show or we're going to leave some of that to be with your original kind of episodes we did starting before that and for reading. So we'll talk about that. But that's how it is. Let's go ahead and do, because we have a couple of other questions that are worthwhile. Certainly, I'm going to handle a question. Then, Curtis, I know you had a direct question that I'm going to handle as well. But we're going to go ahead and handle this one that came up really quickly uh, because we have Domingo saying, mirroring patches versus edging embroidery machine suggestions. Mirroring is a very useful thing. If you guys don't know what that is, a mirroring machine is an overlock machine where you manually put a patch through this edging machine and it produces an overlock stitch, much like a serger over the edge. And your question is whether we do mirroring or edging via embroidery machine really depends on the kinds of patches you're doing, the shapes you're doing, and the scale of your work. If you're doing a lot of simple badge shapes that don't have a lot of insets, you're doing squares, you're doing rounded rectangles, you're doing badges and circles and ovals all the time. I can totally see going to doing mirroring, classic mirroring, if that's the kind of edge people are looking for. If you're doing complicated shapes with cut in edges, insets, things like that, you're most likely going to be doing either hot knife cutting or soluble stabilizer method where we put down either a water soluble, heat soluble, or tear away stabilizer of some kind. I don't mean classical tear away. I mean uh, there are tear out badge films that often heat the excess away, and then you'll embroider on and tear out. You guys know that I helped work on Embrilliance's Merrily, so you know I have a dog in this hunt. I'm going to say that right off the top of the bat. And Merrily allows you to create a faux embroidered, a faux marrowed edge that is automated and very nicely uh, resizes and rescales to size. So you know that that's a possibility, and I do recommend it, especially because we can do things like have an inset hole that would be impossible on a traditional marrow machine. So if you're doing super complex edges like that, even if you look at the big patch companies, the big patch and emblem companies that often are going to do hot cut or some other method or laser cut, they're still going to use satin stitch edging or some other sort of embroidered edging. So on those and on small runs, those are super useful. So that's something that I think that you should think about. If you're doing really small runs, you're not doing the same kind of shapes over and over again, and you're not doing fairly simple shapes that are easy to run your marrow machine around. For those super small runs, for super complicated shapes, I recommend using an embroidered edge on the patches. I did a lot of very small run patch runs for, like I said, for movies and TV. For that, where we're doing custom shapes and we're not doing a lot of standard shapes, or at least there's enough shapes that are not standard, it made a lot more sense for me to use a soluble stabilizer method where I usually use water soluble because I had the ability to do it. These days, I probably would use maybe the plastic method or some other sort of film method where I would stitch it out entirely on the machine and then tear it away or clean up the edges after. Or, like I said, with the soluble method, I would use a pre-cut piece of applique and embroider the edge. So those are the suggestions I would have on that. Mirroring, if you got the classic ones, you're running hundreds of them, you're doing badges and rounded rectangles and ovals and stuff like that, and the shapes aren't that difficult. It is a manual thing you have to learn, but it is still useful. So it's a wonderful thing to bring that in if you're going to be doing patches all the time. You're doing patches all the time, lots of classic badges, lots of classic shapes. Go for it, bring that in. But that's something you're going to have to learn, and you're still going to have to put together your patch assemble the emblem and all the layers that are part of that, and you're still going to have to be either hand cutting or hot cutting or something else to get those out, and then you're edging the blank when you're done. That's just part of it. You might be doing things like clinkers, which is like a press that cuts them out with dies. Depends on if you're doing a bunch of the same shape or not. If you're doing super custom stuff with inset shapes with holes through it, stuff like that, use an embroidered edge. Like I said, something like Merrily or Stitch Artist 3 will give you that kind of faux edge that's programmatic, or you can contact people. Hey, Jeff Fuller over the Embroidery Nerd, he's got his Fuller border, which is the same sort of faux edge, and he'll digitize something custom for you. That's not an automated program. That's something where you're going to have to contract with him. And he's got a lovely looking border that you could use for the same kind of thing as well. And he'll do custom shapes for you. And that's a motif based shape that you can use. The thing I'll say is that the larger scale I'm going, and I don't mean large as in the patch size, the more I'm doing the same kind of patches over and over and over again, I'm going to be looking at automation. And if they are simple shapes, I can thoroughly see how developing a practiced hand on a Mero machine makes sense for you. If you're doing more individual orders, small run pieces, complicated stuff, embroidered border edges all the way, and it's something that I've taught, and I've even sold a class on doing it before. So you'll find a lot out there, and it's worth checking out. All right, so yeah, you're welcome, Domingo. Glad to be helpful. Like I said, not always the same thing that I would do, and it's not the same. Susan says, "Can you mirror with a serger?" I've seen people really tighten up that stitch and try and do it. It doesn't look the same. It's not the same kind of pattern. So could you edge something with a serger? I've seen serger edge patches. I don't love the look. It's not the same thing. You can edge a piece of material with a serger though, and you can work on that stitch, try and get it tight. It doesn't look quite like a mirroring machine does. For me, I probably wouldn't bother. That's not something I would want to do. If I'm going to the point of that much difficulty, I would probably just do an embroidered edge patch and use some sort of soluble stabilizer. All right, but I do have something direct that we had a question from Curtis. And though this is a very technical question in that it's really specific, I think it does actually have a couple things to talk about that are more general. Before I get there, I'm going to do one last thing though, guys. Like I said, there's that Images Magazine article. Because I said I would share that, I am going to go ahead and share that real quickly to make sure you guys have that if you want it. So there is an article where I talk about planning for the new year. So it's kind of about new business and measuring and mindfulness, setting meaningful goals, all that stuff. That is up here. So if you want to check that out, I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see it as well. But yeah, if we go ahead and do that right here, this is making your make your new year measure up. This is over at Images Magazine UK, and it should be all available here as well as on this QR code. Images-magazine.com will get you there to the digital version of it, but bit.ly/NEWMEAS will give you kind of my rubric for what I think you should do to start the new year. Nice piece of reading. If you guys want to talk about that more and about goal setting and stuff like that, let me know. We can cover that coming up next week. I don't have a particular thing planned exactly for next week, so I can always be a little more malleable with that. But like I said, I want to try and keep this one a little tighter than I usually do. But here we go. bit.ly/NEWMEAS. If you want to talk about Q1 planning, you want to talk about what you should do to measure and be mindful. This little spread here is just a couple of tips that can help you think about what you're doing in the next year and get yourself on the right track. So, like I said, something to think about, something that I think we'll leave for next time. However, we do have that one more question. Like I said, I always want to do these Q&As real quick. Q&As I think are always the kind of the heart and soul of lives, is being able to interact with you. So this is what Curtis said. He said, "Can you explain how to do a fill on a column 3/4 of the way up and then go to the top and come back down?" I may not exactly know what you're trying to do here, Curtis, but I am going to show you what I think you're talking about, and we'll talk about it really briefly in the kind of course of just explaining briefly how we can handle shapes and filling of shapes and starting and stopping where we want to. So a direct digitizing type of question, right? So this is what I think you're trying to say here, Curtis. So we'll bring your comment up one more time to make sure I'm clear on this. Like how to do a fill on column 3/4 of the way up and go to the top, come back down. Uh, how do we enter and exit is really what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about filling areas with stitches, and we want to figure out how to enter and exit. There are a few different ways we can handle this, no matter what kind of shape we're working on. And certainly, I'm just going to show you a column very simply to keep this tight. But a shape with holes, I actually have talked about fill shapes with holes in them and how you can split them up into multiple shapes before. There's an entire episode on filling that I haven't had a chance to pull up here, but you can make the shapes in multiple ways. You can cut them apart. You can do it in one stop. The thing is, when we're filling an area with stitches, There's multiple ways to go about it. And in the case of what you're talking about, the first way you would handle is through start and stop points. And so what we see here are three identical setups, right? Over here in this one, we've got three identical pieces of column, of three identical columns full of fill stitches, right? The first one, however, is a single piece. The second one is made of two pieces, and technically the third one is three different objects. You can see we have one object, two object, and three objects here, but they all do essentially the same thing. So the first thing I'm going to show you is we're going to run these back and see how they run, right? So the first one, here we are, we're filling up toward the top. We stop, go up to the top, and fill back down to an exit point there, right? Same thing happens in this one. Same thing happens in the third one, but those are all done with three different methods. Each one of those has a different method applied to it. So the first one here is just with start and end points. If you have a clear object that's entirely filled with the same kind of stitches and you've drawn it as one shape, in this case, we can see here I've got one shape. What we have on this particular piece is one rectangle and we have four corners. We've got our inclination line, our stitch angle line going directly horizontal on it. In this case, we start from this bottom left-hand corner and we're setting, you see this little green bow tie in the bottom left-hand corner is my start point. This red bow tie, and this is only in Stitch Artist. You're looking at Stitch Artist right now. So Stitch Artist 3 is the software I'm in. However, the entry and exit points are going to be in any digitizing software. Wilcom, Pulse, whatever. You're going to have entry and exit points on the software. And this allows for a automated way of starting and stopping the fill. Starting and stopping any sort of stitch type within a particular object. So in this case, that means our left-hand side here in the bottom corner, we have our entry point in green. We have our exit point here in red. If we wanted to fill all the way to the top and not have any other input on that, we would go ahead and fill all the way to the top, right? And what would happen in that case, if we go back to play it back, is that the design would fill all the way from the bottom to the top. If we want to stop and go 3/4 of the way through and jump back down, all we really necessarily have to do is move our endpoint here. When we move the endpoint here, the software is immediately going to stop at this point and it's going to use travel stitching to jump up to the top and then fill back down so that we can exit this point. Whenever we move start and end points, what we're really doing is allowing the software to break this up into multiple pieces. In the digitizing software itself, however, it's not going to break this up for you. The thing that you've entered, the shape that you've entered remains the same. It is not broken as a shape. There's no new nodes. I'm not going to be able to take these two shapes apart. But in the background, what it's essentially doing is treating this like two blocks of fill, and it's implementing a travel run in between them. So as we can see, this piece fills up to this point, and then depending on your software, it may have settings for this travel run. In this case, it has this travel run, jumps up pretty quickly, has a fairly long stitch length, and goes back down. Depending on your software, you may be able to control a little bit more about that, but it's automated. What it's going to do is it's going to go up to the point where the exit point is, and then track back down to it from the top. Exactly how it's done, just move your endpoint. So in that case, all we have to do to get to where you're talking about is we have our start point here, we have our end point here. Wherever we move that bow tie, that red bow tie is going to be our end point. And the same thing with the start. The thing though, you're going to notice with the start points is wherever you move the start point, you're probably just going to get travel stitches before you do any filling. It's going to go out to the extent and then it'll start filling rather than filling down to that point from that area and then traveling. It's going to do a small travel stitch and then start filling the area. So that's how you do it in an automated fashion. Second fashion, which is partially automated, still has the start and end routine, is to use two blocks of fill. Now, this could be a much more complicated shape, but the thing is, just because we have outwardly a full area that has to be filled with a certain kind of stitch doesn't mean it has to be one shape. Now, I usually break shapes up to create more dimension, to create more depth, to create multiple stitch angles, but you can also break things up to make them travel the way you need them to, the way that you're trying to do here, because you want to end at a certain point. In this case, what you can see is I have two separate shapes. I have this shape at the bottom, I have this shape at the top, and these are two separate pieces. But what you can see from this shape at the bottom, this shape at the top, is that I actually have my start and end points different. Start point's bottom left-hand corner, but because I have stopped here at this end where I'm eventually going to fill back to, that's where my endpoint is because I have a separate shape. I've drawn two column shapes that together fuse into one column. The one thing you'll also notice here is that I have a very small overlap between the shapes. Now I can zoom in a little bit and give you a better look at it, but what we can say here is that I actually have drawn these shapes with a small overlap between them. You'll see how that line dances a little bit between the two. That's because I have manually instituted a small overlap, something that is automatically handled by software when you're using start and end points. So if you're not using start and endpoints, you may want to have a one line. I've used a one density measurement about. So I've got like a half density length. I've got about 0.2 millimeters of overlap, about one row of stitching of overlap here. And I actually manually overlapped those two shapes. However, in a semi-automated way, I've used the automatic travel stitching in this case as well. It does act just like the first piece, goes up, travels up, and goes back down. But you can see I'm using an automated travel run here. This is not a separate travel run. What I have done is I've set my start and end points. Start point here, end point here. And on the second shape, I started where I ended on the previous shape, and the end point is right in the same spot. Why? Because I want to, I've ended here, and I want to start directly from that spot, travel up, and stitch back down. And as you can see, that's exactly what actually happened in the final generation. So that's the second option. Third option is the all manual option. And the all manual option, you actually do different things with your travel. And in this case, you can see that where the travel on these pieces, the travel goes directly straight across. And you can see how the initial travel stitch actually jumps straight across from this end here before it goes up the center in order to do the travel. It's a very straight line. It goes in the same angle as the rest of the stitching, but some people might want to cut out a little bit that length, or they might just decide they like to travel in a different way. In that case, you can do this manually. We have two shapes again that are overlapped just like the last one, but if you see in that centerpiece there that different type of run, well, what that is, I've actually got a run. I've got a run object that I digitize separately, and that run object has its own settings where I've set it as a single stitch. In this case, got 2.5 millimeter length that probably could have longer since this is set up as a really huge column. But truthfully, that's not really the point here. The thing to notice is that with our start and end points on this piece, I no longer have them overlapping on this top piece. Why? Because this new fill starts from this back half, starts from the top and runs down because I did the travel portion manually. And you can see the start and end points on the travel run line. We fill from the bottom left corner up to the top right corner. I manually plot in my travel stitching. You can see here that I've used a little angle in and angle out, just a preference thing, depends on how you like to do it. And then I'm filling back down to the split from the top here to the bottom. So now I've got three objects but it runs very similarly. So this piece, one object with a start and end point. The second version has two objects, but we're using the start and end point in the automatic travel. And the third version allows me to stop here to travel out manually, and then it goes back to the end. Now, why is this important? First, I'm sure you're going to say, this seems like something I could just do a start and ends. Why would you care about this? Why would you bother with this? One of the reasons why this can still be important to you, even if this particular use case doesn't tickle your fancy, the thing that might be interesting to you is this. Imagine now that I have something else I need to go do in this file. Like I have to go somewhere and have something appear as if it's underneath the top half of this shape. Like something else is going to happen. Let's say that I have this piece here, and imagine that I have a different stitch angle, maybe like a letter. And imagine for whatever reason, it's coming in and it needs to be underneath this piece. Imagine that for just a moment. I can manually digitize this one portion. In fact, I'll move this into place so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's imagine I'm trying to make this piece look like it's coming under there. Now, I wouldn't do this in fills. Imagine this is a satin stitch and it's a lot more sensible. But I want this piece to look like it's under the entire line here, but I can't travel in that way. I can do this entire piece. Like, let's say I have something else going on down the bottom. I travel through this entire piece and stitch it, stop short, go and do the piece that has to look like it's under the entire column, and then finish the column so that it looks like this piece is one unbroken whole. This is where it can become something you might want to do, because you could travel up to a point, and let's say we want to travel up to here. We end over here. We start this column here. We finish this column here. We have our start point here, and then we exit at this point. Now we can look at why this might be important if we're trying to hide that section or tuck it under, maybe for depth or for the purposes of making something look like it has that overlap. We run up from the bottom, go out into our piece that's supposed to look like it's underneath that whole stroke, and then we finish the stroke, and now it looks like we have an unbroken stroke here and that this piece was underneath it the whole time. And we don't have to run this one first if it makes less sense to the rest of the way that the garment runs, especially on a larger piece where we might have some outline or something else where we don't want to run all over the place and have it traveling large distances where we might mess with our ability to keep registration. So that's why it can be important to do things like this. If we're just making a column, obviously making a column and it's just starting and stopping, you're just trying to get from one place to another. Obviously, do this. Use your endpoints and just stop your endpoint wherever it's supposed to be, and it'll handle it. Though the other thing is, if you're doing something like, let's say, centering something out on a cap, it also means if you've got a fill on a cap and it needs to center out, but it looks like one element, you might be able to stop, fill one side out, travel back to the bottom where you started and fill the other side out before running stuff on top of it. And then you don't have to necessarily draw something in one object, even though it looks like one object on the final piece. That kind of look, or where you have things that are intentionally overlapped for dimension, like things I often do with satin stitch work, with text, with carving out silhouettes, then it might make sense for you to think about how can I travel manually and maybe travel out to something else and then complete a column after the piece that needs to look like it's underneath it. So, like I said, seems like I was going into a whole lot of detail about filling a column. Why don't you just use your start and end points to get where you want to go? Well, because sometimes it makes more sense to fill an area to a point, to create a design and get all of the parts stitched out to a point, and then track back to something that's supposed to be underneath it, track back to make something look overlapped in the proper way, track back and handle something that's just in another quadrant. Maybe we just literally are doing a large design, it's falling all out of registration. We decide instead of doing one color all in one area where we do the entire jacket back in one color and then come back with all the outlines and then they all start falling out of registration, that we do one area at a time. We do a quadrant at a time, handling all the colors. Maybe we have to have a couple extra color changes, but even if an object looks continuous, as long as we're careful about how much distortion we have between the first part of it and the second part of it, we can actually fill them and run them together at the final moment. All right, folks. Like I said, it seems very technical. It seems like a lot of talk over something very simple, but I think it's worthwhile to think of in that fashion. So, like I said, I think it's worthwhile to think of in the fashion of how do I get where I'm going? How do I make those unified pieces? And if nothing else, just to understand that just because something looks like one piece in a final, in the rendering, in the art, doesn't mean it has to be one object. The only thing I'm going to caution you against, or at least caution you about, is when we're breaking pieces up, and I'll bring it back up on screen just very briefly. When we're breaking pieces up like this, can you have some textural issues where there might be a slight difference in texture on the fill from top to bottom? Can you sometimes see that last line? Not so much as it looks like here in the preview. That's just an artifact of how the previews look. Can there be a little bit of weirdness in that overlap? Yes, you may have to look at that and see if that works for your particular piece. If you have to have a fill that looks smooth as glass, you may want to look for an area where there's less kind of obviousness to where that jump is, where that break is. But most of the time, if your fill settings are the same and you're careful about your placement, you're going to find that aside from, like I said, running all over a large area and then coming back to something much later, so you racked up a lot of distortion before you finish it, that you're going to have a pretty even finish either way. All right. So, like I said, folks, I want to make sure you guys know the request lines are open. I'm going to try and keep these shows closer to an hour from here on out if I can, but there may be some more content that I do to kind of fill in some of the stuff that I usually would do. But like I said, the request line is open. When I say email me or contact me, this is what I'm talking about. EricCampbell.com. If you go to the top, it will say contact me, and the contact page is right here. That is also here on the QR code. So you can pause that, scan that with your phone, and you will end up where you are supposed to be to contact me. And I want to hear what you guys need. I'm here for the request line as much as doing topics. I'll certainly be bringing topics to you as I've got more classes coming up. But I just want to make sure you know that I'm here to make sure you guys get what you need out of me. But with that, let's go ahead and just really briefly tell you where I'm going to be live coming up soon and where my live classes are going to be and what they're going to be about. So here we are. First, Impressions Expo. I am showing up at Long Beach Impressions Expo very shortly. And you can see I'm here with a lot of your favorite people in the industry. But here I am at Impressions Expo. The day before Impressions Expo starts, I have my long session. So on January 19th, digitizing your first design, finding your foundations. So I'll be talking about the foundations of digitizing, the things you need to know before you digitize your first design. Next, I'll be talking about in-house and outsource. That is on Friday the 20th, 9 a.m. In-house and outsource digitizing solutions, talking about what it means to bring something in-house, to have digitize yourself in-house, or why you might outsource and how to mix those together. After that, I have vintage values and machine embroidery. So style, stitch, and segments, talking about kind of vintage textures, handmade textures, and the way to make your embroidery look more vintage, look more distressed, and interesting things about that. And lastly, on that Sunday, we've got presenting embroidery's value proposition. And this is all available if you want to check that out over at impressionsexpo.com. So impressionsexpo.com is where you want to go to get that detail if you want to check that out, or search that out anywhere you can find, like I said, the happy kind of commercial side of this world. That's where you're going to find it. For some reason or another, I lost that banner, but let me grab that for you and let you guys know what it looks like. So that is impressionsexpo.com is where you're going to find this information. And if you check that out, you'll be able to see the show, see more about it. And this is kind of the big show for the year, where all of the vendors are going to be. So in Long Beach at the end of the month, should be quite a few people here. You got Justin teaching 3D foam. You've got people from all over teaching different things. I'll just say that much. So lots of embroidery and screen print and digital printing, DTG, DTF content, and I'll be there teaching those 4 classes coming up at the end of January. So that's impressionsexpo.com. What I also have coming up after that is the DAX show in February. So let's go ahead and talk about that briefly. This is DAX Kansas City. So if you haven't seen the DAX shows, this is Decorated Apparel Expo, Kansas City. We're coming up February 24th and 25th. However, if you see this, I am actually on the 23rd, once again, on my birthday. I spend a lot of birthdays in Kansas City, folks. DAXshow.com is where you find this detail. But building up your digitizing design elements and execution, refresh the basics and go beyond, from developing an eye for interesting design or interpreting designs through the selection and configuration of stitch types to digitizing skills and shape creation. So we're going to spend some time on the why and examine the shapes you need and how to create them so you can get the effects you want. So another kind of a building up your digitizing basics kind of a session going on Thursday, and that's from 1 to 4:30. It's one of my longer sessions. And then you're also going to see me on Friday, February 24th from 10:20 a.m. doing Embroidery RX, a digitizer's view, where I talk about analyzing and dealing with troubleshooting in your embroidery designs. So that is in Kansas City, though what I am going to make sure you guys know is that when we're talking about DAX, when you do the DAX show, we do all 3 of the DAX shows. So currently, unless something goes very differently than I expect, I'm going to be at Kansas City, February 24th, 25th, Treasure Island, Minnesota, March 31st through April 1st, and then Tinley Park, Illinois, in the Chicagoland area, April 14th and 15th. But as with the Kansas City show, if you want to go to that longer session of mine, it's the day before the show opens. That's workshop day. So the 30th here and the 13th here. So Kansas City, Treasure Island, and Tinley Park. To be announced whether I'll be doing the Texas show for Impressions Expo. I haven't signed that one yet. Very likely I'll probably be doing the Texas show for Impressions as well, but that might change. For now, though, I can tell you for sure I am booked and ready to rock. I am booked and have a hotel and have flights. So I will be in California January, and I will be out there at the DAX shows. I'm signed for those. So like I say, I always like to wait till I've signed a contract and the contract is in for those shows. So you can expect to see me there. All right, folks. With that, like I said, I would love to see you guys talk about what you want to see for the rest of the year. Definitely want to see more about what you want out of the show, what makes this valuable for you, and happy to share these things with you as we get going. If you want to hear more about the startup stuff for the year, I'm absolutely happy to do it. But I think it's great for us to kind of keep the show manageable, where everybody has a chance to listen to it and can get that fit into their day. All right, folks, with that, I'm very happy to have had you back for this Education Friday, and I can't wait to see you again next week.